Morning everyone. So I'm out doing some bird photography this morning and I've got with me the Nikon Z9 and my favorite lens that I've ever owned. This is the 500PF for Nikon's F mount. That said, I do want to pick up a second telephoto lens this year for the Z mount, and I thought it'd be fun today to take you birding with me. We'll talk through some of the lenses that I'm considering, and I'll give you some of the reasons why the 500PF has remained my favorite lens of all time. So on with it. This is an unedited photo of a northern parula. We'll come back to this at the end and post-process it together for Photo Edit Friday. Alright, let's take a minute to talk about the 500PF. Despite being announced around 6 years ago in 2018, the 500PF is still a top-tier lens today. It was designed using a special type of lens element called phase Fresnel, hence the PF, which was actually first made popular with usage in lighthouses. This PF element is what allows for the lens to have such a compact size and low weight while maintaining a wideish aperture and stunning image quality. In fact, the lens only weighs roughly 3 pounds. Compared to the 500F4 for the F mount, which weighs in at over 6 pounds, you can see why the portability and the ease of hand-holding would appeal to a bird photographer. It's also dust and weather resistant and offers a premium feeling build quality. I've taken it out into the elements and it has never missed a beat. I've taken most of my favorite photos with this lens, and I am not exaggerating when I say that the sharpness and detail of the 500PF, even when it's wide open, is absolutely superb. That all said, I have no intention of selling mine, but I would like to consider a native Z-mount telephoto to add to my collection. So let's talk through a few options that might complement the 500PF. So first on my list of lenses that I'm considering is the true successor to the F-mount's 200 to 500, which was a chunky boy, but it was a lens that I owned and I loved. And of course I'm talking about the Z-mount's 180 to 600. Now I think that this lens has two things going for it. First is the price. It is the cheapest of all of the lenses that I am considering, running at somewhere around $1,600 US, so that's a big advantage. The second is the flexibility. It's got a variable focal length from 180 to 600, which allows me to shoot anything from mammals to, birds, and that's something that sometimes with the 500PF can be a little bit difficult. Now, it has two disadvantages in my mind too, and those are the potential quality and the weight. Running at about a pound heavier than the 500PF, I really think that the quality needs to be great to be worth the trade-off. I'm not too sure that the flexibility will be worth the weight trade-off. That's something to think about. But it does run, again, about a pound heavier than the 500PF, and that was one of the biggest advantages of that lens to me. And the second disadvantage I just touched on is the potential quality. This is not an S-tier lens, so I'd be curious to see how the image quality stands up to the 500PF, which, let's be honest, punches way above its weight still today in 2024. So that's the first lens I'm considering, the 180 to 600. So the next lens on my list to consider is the 600PF, and I'm going to make this one quick because it's probably a no-go for me. The lens is just too close to the 500PF to make it worth adding to my kit. It weighs almost the same, the quality's only marginally better, and it costs $5,000 US, so there just isn't enough extra there for me to justify the extra cost. The third one on my list to consider is the 800PF, and this one's interesting. So it is the most expensive on my list, coming in at about $6,500 US, which is a lot. And it's also the heaviest, far outweighing the 500PF, so another thing to consider. That said, it does add something that I've never really had in my kit, and that is all of the extra reach I would need to shoot small birds. 800 millimeters is nothing to sneeze at. So I think for me, it's really going to come down to, do I want the convenience, flexibility, and value of the 180 to 600, or do I want to go all out and really lean into bird photography even more by adding something like the expensive 800PF to my kit, which I think would also leave a healthy spot for my 500PF to still remain a useful member of the lens lineup. So I think it really just comes down to, can I justify the cost? I don't know. All right, so as promised, we're going to do some post-processing on this lovely image of a northern parula. And one thing I'd like to immediately call out as we get started is that this image was taken with the 500PF, and I was cropped into DX crop mode, which provides a 1.5 times crop and means that you're shooting at the equivalent focal length of a 750mm lens. And the bird is still very tiny in this frame. So this is really one of those areas where I feel like maybe an 800mm lens would really help to fill a gap in my kit, because I can't really crop this image too much more, lest it get pixelated and start to really degrade in quality. So we're gonna have to treat this one sort of with its environment and keep that in mind as we edit. And as I was thinking about it, I think that means I'm gonna go with a 4:5 crop. So let me give you an idea of what I mean. I'm gonna turn on my guides here in my grid so I can see. I want to line up the center of the photo maybe with the bird's eye. Make sure I get this little stick in the bottom so it's not cut off. Let's take a look how that looks. All right, I think that's what we're gonna go with. It's maybe a little bit more down here. Let's balance it a little bit more. That was a little too far, a little too aggressive. I'd like to balance most of the stick in between these two third lines of the grid. Maybe center the bird and the bird's eye directly in the center of the frame. And yes, I think that looks good. That's probably all we can do with the cropping, again, without degrading the quality. So that's what we're gonna go with. Now, the next thing I like to do, this is a little trick that I showed in my last photo edit Friday, is I like to add a filled adjustment layer, and take down the saturation on every single color in the image. Because sometimes I feel like there are color casts in an image that you don't really notice until you do this, and sometimes you can minimize an image and make it look more simple by taking out some of the distracting colors and emphasizing some colors while de-emphasizing others. The primary two colors of a northern parula that I like to emphasize are yellow and blue. So I'm going to start there, and I'm going to bring up the saturation on the yellow first, and I'm going to oversaturate it just a little bit. Again, you don't want to go crazy with your saturation slider, or the bird isn't going to look natural. I'm going to go with maybe 5 or 6, and then I'll do the same thing with the blue. Let's saturate the colors without going overboard. And already, if you look at the before and after, that's looking pretty good. The main color that's lacking, that's left, is green. So we obviously can't leave that out. Let's go ahead and bring the green back, but I'm actually thinking I want to leave the green desaturated a little bit. So you can see with the before and the after that this gives a little bit more of a painterly color and helps to really emphasize the beautiful colors of the parula. Now, clicking the before and after, I can see there are also some reds in the leaves that I don't want to leave out. So I'm going to slide this back and forth, and I see a little bit of red, but it might actually show in the oranges. There we go. So here we are. I like the oranges. Oversaturate those just a little bit. And clicking back and forth, I think that looks pretty good. Now before I finish, I want to add another filled adjustment layer, and I have a little preset that I've saved called base. And all that does is bring up the exposure a little bit. It adds a tiny, tiny little S curve here on the curves, and it brings down the whites and the blacks just a smidge, as well as slightly shifting the white balance from the original image. I apply this to most of my images, and then I use the opacity slider here to adjust, it to my liking. But actually, clicking back and forth, I do think it enhances this image. So this is where I would leave it if I were in purely Capture One, but I'm going to show you one more thing that I like to do with some of these images, because if I zoom in here, I'm going to see a lot of noise in the image. Now, obviously, nobody's going to be looking at this at 300%, but I think there is a bit of a reduction of quality because I cropped into DX crop mode and I cropped again, which would be something that I could avoid if I had that 800mm. So to reduce some of this noise, you could use Capture One's built-in noise reduction, or I like to toss this into Topaz Photo AI and do some noise reduction, some AI noise reduction on the image. So let's switch over to Topaz and take a look. All right, so we've made it to Topaz AI, and I'm just going to show a little before and after slider here. Hard to tell at the fit here, 41%, but if you zoom in a little bit and look at some of this noise on the left, Topaz does a really good job of cleaning up some of that extra distracting noise and keeping the quality of the bird intact. And that's one thing I really like about Topaz. So I'll go ahead and save this image, and we'll hop back over to Capture One to see the difference. All right, so I am back, and I'm just going to show you a side-by-side between the backgrounds of these two images, and you can see that Topaz has done a really good job of just cleaning up what, no one would be looking this close at the image, but what looks like a bunch of garbled and distracting noise artifacts in the image. So it looks a lot better. And one thing that I have noticed in this image is that there are some spider webs here, and artistic choice. Some people want to leave those, some people find them distracting and would like to edit them out. I want to show you what my process would look like if I were to edit these out, just in case you'd like to choose that for artistic purposes in your photos. And I would do this actually not in Capture One, but I would prefer to use Photoshop. So let's jump over to Photoshop and we'll make some of the final touches to this image. All right, so we've made it to Photoshop, and I am here to edit some of these spider webs. I really like Photoshop's spot healing tool because it really just makes it easy to knock out these spider webs. I find that the Capture One spot healing tool is pretty abysmal. It maybe gets it right for me 1 out of every 5 or 6 times. And otherwise it does a terrible job and brings more artifacts that just look worse. So I really like to do this editing in Photoshop. And I see that even Photoshop's giving me a little bit of trouble right now. So I'm going to switch over to the healing brush instead of the spot healing brush, because it lets you set a manual spot to learn from, to mirror when you're doing some spot healing. So you pick the spot you like, you hold down the option button if you're on a Mac, and then you can start just doing your cleanup. But I use that sparingly because, again, it's not totally perfect. But if the automatic spot healing isn't doing the job, I like to switch over and just manually set that point so that it learns. So I think that looks rather nice, a lot less distracting, and I would be happily done with this image. But I'm going to show you one more little trick that can look nice depending on the image, and that is to use the select feature from the menu and to select your subject. Let's take a close look and make sure we've got all of the stick and the branch and the bird. It looks like for the most part we do. And then I'm going to invert the selection by going to the select menu and clicking in inverse. Then if you go to filter and blur and lens blur, one thing that Photoshop allows you to do is to take that background and just ever so slightly blur it a little bit more, which will really emphasize the bird and the branch in the foreground. And it's not quite the same as having an f4 or having that $15,000 lens, but short of that, you can give your image some of that effect in Photoshop by just blurring the background. Now, I wouldn't go crazy with it, because let me crank this up to 100 and show you what it would look like. It is insane and it looks unbelievable, and it's actually taking my Mac a hot minute to render this, but it doesn't look believable or natural at all. So be careful to use this sparingly if you do, and I would say like leave it at 20 or less, just a slight lens blur to really make the subject pop. And I'll show you the difference. So let's hop back over to Capture One and we'll just do a side by side, and then we will call it a video. In terms of my lens hunt, thanks for entertaining my ideas. Again, I am going to keep the 500PF, but I am strongly leaning towards either the 180-600 or the 800PF as an addition to my lineup that I think will really help me to fill a potential gap that I have. And I'll be perfectly transparent when I say that I am leaning towards the 800PF at this point. So we'll find out in the future what I eventually decide on, but in the meantime, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think, and don't forget to hit all those YouTube buttons so that YouTube sends this video to folks and the channel will grow. So again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.